Hello and welcome back to Questions That Matter, where we discuss the interesting and exciting and important research that we do here at Trustbridge, or at least some of the folks who work at Trustbridge have done in the past. So today I'm very excited to welcome Chitrakshi Jain. Chitrakshi and Prashant have written a very interesting book on court reforms called Tariq Pe Justice, and I recommend that all of you read it because it is one of the first books that I have read that really opened my eyes into thinking about court reforms and court delays in a way that a lot of the literature before had not done. So today we're going to discuss with Chitrakshi what led her to writing the book and what the core insights from their work are. So welcome, Chitrakshi.
Thank you for having me.
So, Chitrakshi, this is such a fascinating read where it takes a different view on why is it that we have had court, why is it that we have court delays? I think that while court delays and Tariq Pe Tariq, as we remember from the Sunny Deol film, which you also allude to in the book, has always been on our minds. And the think tank world, so to speak, started looking at this more seriously, perhaps a little over 10 years ago. And you suddenly had this spurt of papers and articles on backlog in the courts and how we might reform the courts. What made you get into this space and ask the question so differently? So I'll ask you to reflect also on how differently are you looking at the idea of court reforms, because we've always heard of backlogs and fewer judges and fewer courts and under resourcing, etc. Those were the standard reasons that we've always heard. So what made you question those reasons, or what got you to this point?
Uh, sure, this is an important question. So this research kind of dates back to 2019, where Prashant and I were staffed on a team on judicial reforms at the Center for Legal Policy. And in that 1 year, we had discovered that the usual suspects which were held responsible for delays, were not really making sense to explain the larger structural issues that were compromising the ability of judges to deliver justice on time. That led us to probe deeper into what were the structural factors that were withholding them from delivering fast and good quality justice. Uh, the other reason we decided to write about court reforms in this manner was also that there was a lot of attention on the higher courts, that is the high courts and the Supreme Court, but nobody had really written about the service conditions of the district courts in as much detail. So everyone knew that independence of the judiciary was part of the conversation, but perhaps people had not paid attention to the district judges which staff the courts across states in the entire country, and which sort of form the first tier of justice for most citizens, because most citizens are not going to file appeals and go to the writ courts that much. And it was slightly astonishing to find this gap. That so much had been written about the higher courts, but not enough attention had been paid to the district courts and the way they are administered, especially.
Yeah. And so what are the key takeaways for you from, from your work? Or if I may put it a little differently, if somebody were to get like a quick summary of what is it that your book is saying, what would it be?
I think the novel argument that we're trying to make in the book is that perhaps the attention from the resource crunch argument should shift and go, and people should probe a little bit deeper about how the district judges are evaluated. So the most important argument that we put forth is that the way they're being disciplined by the high court judges. So it is quite clear that they are insulated from the interference from the government. We have found that disciplinary action can be initiated against judges for complaints about misconduct and corruption, but when they are penalized for after a disciplinary inquiry, often the charges on corruption and misconduct are not even proven. And sometimes for granting bail too recklessly or too frequently, the disciplinary inquiries presume that there are inferences of extraneous considerations where no such evidence is in fact found. And we found this to be deeply problematic concerning because it makes it obvious that these judges don't actually enjoy security of tenure. And this is a very important facet of independence of these judges. And if they are constantly in fear about how they're going to be evaluated, about the performance reviews that they're constantly subjected to, we believe that they're not really free to decide cases. And this is a very core part of decisional independence.
And so, how do you see, you did mention that they are not free to decide, but how does that play out? I mean, is it that they take fewer cases or they delay because nobody wants to take a tough decision that might or might not, then they'd get accused of being partial or being corrupt? How does that play out?
So, for example, if you make an example out of one judge, if, for example, charges against a particular judge on misconduct and corruption are not really proven, but an inference is drawn that that a bribe was exchanged, this sends a message to the other colleagues of that judge that perhaps if you are too reckless in granting bail, is how you are being perceived, or if you have granted a compensation which your inquiry committee doesn't think was proportionate, you may have disciplinary action taken against you. So this will obviously withhold judges from taking these decisions freely and make them worry about whether it is making them more vulnerable to disciplinary inquiries. The second thing that we also look at is the way the performance review mechanism is structured. They have a unit system in which they are supposed to, they are assigned certain units that they need to complete in each quarter or in a year. And these units are assigned on the basis of, for example, if you complete a trial, you will get a number of units. If you examine a few witnesses, you get these units. But it's very easy to game this methodology. So our hypothesis here is that it's easier for the judge, and this has to be seen in combination with all the other policies like transfers and like roster allocation, which keeps changing. A docket of the judge keeps changing. It's very easy for the judge if you look at these combination of factors. You have a unit system, you can be transferred, your roster will be changed frequently, that you can easily game the unit system to just clear the very easy cases.
Right.
And meet those units, because you know that your caseload will be given to another judge very soon. So our hypothesis is that this is exactly why the more difficult and more complicated cases are the ones that are contributing to the delay and backlog, because it's easier for the judges to do these easy cases and move on to their other judicial work.
So I want to, ask you a little bit more on this moving on to other work. Or you said that judges will know that their cases will be given to somebody else. And I know that in the book you talk a little bit about the transfer system of these judges. So can you again just, tell us what this transfer system is and how do judges move from one place to another?
Yeah, so judges are often transferred frequently, in 2 or 3 years. And this is not really a policy that is recent. So we found records dating back to the 1930s where the Allahabad High Court had issued a circular saying that it seems that the difficult cases are the ones that are languishing on the dockets. And so this is not something that is a recent problem. Other scholars have written about how judges cannot really take control of their courtroom because they become outsiders in a new court where the bar is already entrenched, the court staff is already entrenched, and you keep moving the judge from one place to the other. So the control that the judge should exercise in the courtroom, she's withheld from it because she's an outsider in that system. And in addition to the transfer from one district to another, their docket, the cases that are on their docket also keep changing. So this roster allocation is also a frequent process. We think that this, of course, the transfer policy does not make any sense in current times because the policies don't really articulate an objective that they are trying to further with this policy. For example, if they had clearly articulated that we are trying to embolden impartiality and so that the bar does not become too familiar with the judge, these objectives are not really clearly articulated.
Sure.
This is just a legacy policy which is just being taken forward without any thought. And currently we think it is sort of creating an imbalance in the incentives of the judges, where it is making it easier for them to not look at more difficult cases because it's human tendency to not do the difficult work first.
For sure. You know, one part of your book talks about sort of how the courts are administered, how judges are transferred, and what the incentives are. But the second part of your book also spends a lot of time on data. In terms of what kind of data is collected and what do we actually know about how the court functions. So, can you tell us a little bit about your findings on the data side of things?
So if we look at the most recent database, which is the National Judicial Data Grid, which makes public all the daily orders and all the statistics related to the district courts in India, the first issue is that nobody authenticates the data that is published on that website. There is a strong disclaimer which is given on the website that this data should not be used unless it is verified by the court itself. So this is the first problem, that the people who have made this website, the E-Committee of the Supreme Court of India has sort of managed this program. The National Informatics Center is responsible for running it, but neither of these two public authorities is taking any responsibility for the quality and accuracy of this data. This is the first problem. The second is, what are the metrics that are being collected and published as part of this judicial data grid? We do think that there are some parameters, such as the time spent on cases. Given that judicial time is the most scarce resource in this ecosystem, perhaps we should have a better measure of measuring, better measure to reflect the amount of time a particular case takes, so that we know what is complexity in a trial. So we know that there are certain kinds of cases which are taking more judicial time. There are others which are not. And perhaps to improve the kind of indicators that data is being collected on. Currently, the way NJDG records data, it is not really statistics. It presents, it publishes a lot of data, but there is less meaning in it.
Sure.
The second issue that we found was that it's quite clear, given that nobody validates the authenticity of this data or accuracy of this data. We think that a lot of cases are being double counted. For example, in a case, in a criminal case, if there are 4 accused, you will see that those and they are all accomplices in a particular case, you will see that there will be 4 entries in this data. If there is an application for bail in the same case, you will see that this leads to another new entry. So unless we know that they have a counting system which is more rational, we should not really make NJDG the basis of our assumptions about the judicial system, unless this data is verified and authenticated and we have some certainty about the quality and methodology behind the collection of this data.
So thank you, Chitrakshi, for those wonderful insights. I highly recommend this book to everybody. It really opened my eyes on issues about the judiciary that I had never read or thought about. We are not done talking about this book. In the next video, we will follow this up with the recommendations that Prashant and Chitrakshi have on how we might reform this space. So stay tuned for more. And thank you for being here.